Hey everyone, I'm Dustin and welcome to DB Builds. In this video I'm going to show you how I built this workbench from scratch. It's an amalgamation of a bunch of different plans that I saw. There's things I like about it from lots of different workbenches on the internet. So stick around and you'll see how I built this one.
There were a variety of reasons I decided to build a new workbench. I'd outgrown my last hand tool workbench and wanted to improve upon the design. I'd also recently made some major shop upgrades and needed something that would fit better in the new layout. I also got a great deal on 2 vises from Rockler that I wanted to incorporate into my new bench. So with all of that in mind, I brought about 70 board feet of 8/4 hard maple home to get started on the project. One of the big changes I made to my shop was taking the miter saw out. There are times when it would be convenient to have, but I can do most everything I want on other tools, and with a small garage shop, I need the space. So I broke down the lumber with a jigsaw. I also have a relatively small jointer, and I don't feel particularly comfortable or like I've been particularly successful running longer boards through it. So I flattened the faces of my rough-sawn lumber with a torsion box sled in my planer. This uses a lot of hot glue and painter's tape, but I get flat boards, so it's a win in my book. Once there was a flat face on all the boards, I lowered the planer and flattened the other side as well. As you can imagine, there was a lot of lumber to mill up. This was a real lousy time to break the dust hood on my planer. With both sides flat, I used a simple sheet of MDF with more painter's tape and more hot glue to square up one edge of each board. I wanted the bench top to be close to 3 inches thick, so I ripped each board to 3¼ inches to leave plenty of room for flattening after the glue up, but also maximize usage of the boards that I had on hand. I glued up the bench top in 2 halves. I only filmed one of them, but I'm pretty sure you can guess what it looked like when I did the other one, based on this footage. After the glue dried, I cleaned up most of the squeeze out with a chisel and a card scraper before sending each half through the planer. I got my cardio workout that week by maneuvering these slabs around my garage. And of course, once both sides were flattened and at the same thickness, I glued them together. I used my circular saw and a straight edge to trim the uneven ends of the bench, but the saw didn't cut all the way through, so I just finished it with a pull saw. With the top together, I set about working on the legs. I had some leftover lumber, and I had also milled some shorter boards and cutoffs for these, so I ripped 8 pieces to laminate together for the 4 legs. Then I cleaned up the legs and the table saw after the glue had set. Next, I had to figure out where the legs would be attached. I had planned the length and width of the bench to accommodate the vise hardware I had, but still fit in my shop. I traced the outline of each vise on the underside of the bench top so I could mark the leg locations and make sure nothing would interfere. I had planned on using twin tenons to attach the legs to the top. For some reason, I used every marking gauge I owned to mark these out on the bench and also the legs. You really only need one for this if you mark each piece before you change the setting. I guess I just wanted to show off.
I threw this little jig together to help with the mortises. It bounds the router on the sides, combined with the edge guide, cuts the mortises exactly to the width, and then I'll just adjust this as needed, get the second mortise. Hopefully it works.
I have to say it worked pretty great. The bit I used here was a 1/2 inch spiral upcut bit from CMT Tools. It was super sharp, and the band-aid I'm wearing in these shots is proof. I nicked myself just handling the bit while getting it into the router. The only problem with using the router for the mortises is that it leaves these rounded edges. So I just squared up the mortises with a chisel before moving on to cut the tenons. I marked out the tenons on the legs off camera and then decided to cut them on the table saw. It'd be faster to use a dado stack to do this, but it didn't yet have the appropriate brake cartridge for my saw stop, so I made a lot of quick passes. It still worked out just fine. I made the same cuts on all 4 legs before moving the fence. Notice I used a stop block on the fence when doing this. When the piece contacts the blade, it's no longer touching the block. It wouldn't be safe if it remained in contact with the fence. I put together a quick jig that would ride on the saw fence to help cut the space between the 2 tenons safely and consistently. To keep things simple, I just made the cuts to mark the inside of the tenons on the table saw before chiseling out the waste. The added precision of using the table saw meant that most of the tenons just needed a slight adjustment with chisels to fit the mortises really nicely. Alright, so I did this off camera. I'm going to leave it and not redo it. Sorry. I attached the stretchers. They're going to be attached with dovetail tenons. What I did is I marked them so you can see where everything's going to be. Everything's clamped in place, everything's marked. I'm going to get around to cutting those dovetails, and those I'll actually have footage of. I used the fence jig again to cut the dovetails for the stretchers, just eyeballing the angle and the exact placement as to what I thought would look best. I could have used plenty of other forms of joinery for the stretchers, but I thought the dovetails would look nice and hold well. You also probably noticed that I'm not using maple anymore. I didn't have quite enough for the whole build, so I had to use some elm that I had lying around the shop. I reclamped the stretchers using the layout markings from earlier and marked out the tails on the legs. Then I spent a few hours of quality time with hand tools to saw and chisel out these, well, I'm not sure what they'd be called, but they'd be fun to make. I guess half-lap dovetails, or something like that. I repeated the process you see here 7 more times, getting better each time. The first one took around 30 minutes, but by the last one I could do it in just about 20. Practice makes progress. After some quick test fits, it was time to glue up the leg assembly. Note that the legs are not glued into the top. They're just set in there so I can make sure everything will come out square in the end. The next step was milling up some more lumber to use for the aprons and end cap. I originally intended to use walnut as a contrasting wood, but the most reasonably priced 8/4 lumber that was available was sapelli. And of course they didn't quite have enough. So I had to resaw the apron sides from one larger piece, most of which was done on the table saw and then finished by hand for safety's sake. I've got the sides, the aprons, I guess, just kind of dry fit in there. I got them lined up to the edge. I measured that length so that I can cut the end cap and the chop for the end vise to the proper size, and then work on cutting the joinery for those. I took out that fence jig again to cut some more dovetails, this time on the aprons. I once again eyeballed the locations, but I used the same angle as before. I think it was about 15 degrees. This time, chiseling out the waste was much easier. I clamped the aprons to the end cap to mark out all the tails, and then went back to more sawing and chiseling. I gotta say, the Sapelli was a lot easier to work with than the maple had been. Or perhaps it was because I remembered to sharpen my chisel this time. I temporarily clamped the aprons and end cap onto the bench top so that I could install the vises. I pre-drilled and bolted them to the top first, then put a Forstner bit through the rod holes to mark their location on the end cap. Then I took the end cap and what would be the vise chop over to the drill press to hog out the holes in these marked locations. I repeated this process for the face vise off camera. Finally, it was time to glue the aprons to the bench top and to the end cap as well. I didn't glue the end cap to the maple part of the top to avoid any issues with wood movement, since these were attached perpendicular to each other. While that glue set up, I turned my attention to the leg assembly. I chamfered the bottoms of the legs with my block plane. I also attached these heavy-duty leveling feet to each leg to make up for my extremely uneven garage floor. With the clamps off the top, it was finally time to put everything together. Even though I was able to flip the top on my own, I enlisted my wife to help move the top onto the legs.
Yeah, that'll do. Okay, I'll get it from here.
I elected not to glue the legs to the top so that I could separate them in case I ever needed to move the bench. The fit was tight enough that I actually had to get a little creative when figuring out how to get the parts together. With everything finally taking shape, it was time to finish the vise installation. As you can tell by the amount of time I spent playing with it, I really like the quick release mechanism on these vises. Oh, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but I had to use some more elm scraps when I realized I didn't have enough wood for the face vise chop either. I guess we'll call this the Frankenbench. I attached these retracting casters to each leg. Having everything on wheels when you have a small shop is pretty much necessary, but I used the retractable ones to ensure that the bench would be stable when I needed it to be. With the bench more or less functionally complete, I turned my attention to flattening the top. First I planed down the aprons, end cap, and vise chops to be even with the top. I'd left myself a nice little valley in the middle of the top due to a slightly uneven glue up, so it took a lot of work to get things flat. My smoothing process left a lot to be desired. I'm still learning how to set up my planes properly. The finish isn't perfect, but it's flat and it's good enough for my purposes. I'm sure it will eventually need to be flattened again, so hopefully by then I'll have a better idea what I'm doing. Using the drill press, I drilled some holes in a piece of scrap to make a jig for drilling dog holes. I used an auger bit in my drill for this. Boy, those things have some torque. With a square and a small piece of 3/4 inch dowel to align the jig in each of the previous holes, the dog holes came out nicely vertical and pretty straight across the bench. I added the chamfer to each one using my trim router. Now, I know it's not necessary for a workbench, but I decided to finish it with boiled linseed oil. And oh boy, was it worth the effort. Watch the Sapelli pop as the finish goes on. I'm so glad I took this extra step. With that, the bench was finally done. I put some extra time and effort into the details on this build that are certainly not necessary in the long run, but I sure do like looking at this fella every time I step into my workshop. I have a hunch this one is going to last me for a long, long time.
Alright, so there you have it. That's how I built my workbench. I'm absolutely thrilled with it. It's been collecting a lot of projects, as you can see. I'm preparing for a craft fair in a couple of weeks, so I've got a lot of stuff on it for now. The vices have been absolutely fantastic. I still have to drill some dog holes for the end vise that go across the front. There's been a couple of times when I thought those would have been really useful. A couple of takeaways from the build. Half-blind dovetails are not that hard to do, especially on a large scale like that. So I'm going to be looking to do more of those in the future. Also, it turns out I really like working with the sapelli, which was a nice surprise. I had no idea really what it was when I was getting into it, and it turned out to be pretty easy to work with, and I really love how it came out, especially this strip right along the front here. So once again, thanks for watching. Please like the video if you learned something from it. Subscribe if you like my videos. I'm going to be trying to get a few more out now that I got my shop all set up and cleaned and organized, and this bad boy to do some projects on. Check me out on Instagram if you want to see what I'm up to next, and I'll see you again soon.